This is Andy Gutierrez from StarWars.com, and you are listening to Coffee with Kenobi with Dan Zehr. This is the podcast you're looking for.
This is Ashley Eckstein, Ahsoka Tano from Star Wars The Clone Wars and Star Wars Rebels, and you're listening to Coffee with Kenobi with Dan Zehr.
Joining us today for a cup of coffee, it's his first trip to Coffee with Kenobi, is Adam Christoper. He is the author of Star Wars Shadow of the Sith, available June 28th. Adam, welcome to Coffee with Kenobi.
Thank you very much for having me on.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Before we get to Shadow of the Sith, go ahead and walk us through your journey as a Star Wars fan.
Oh, well, I'm the classic kind of 80s, child of the 80s geek, nerd geek. I grew up with Star Wars. I'm exactly that right age where it was, Star Wars and G.I. Joe, Transformers, Master of the Universe. You name it, I was the perfect, consumer child of all that kind of cool stuff, which I still watch and read. And, I haven't changed at all. Yeah, right. 'Cause it's
and
great.
Mask, all good stuff.
Oh, my goodness. Man. Oh, yeah, that's a kind of forgotten gem. Yeah. But with Star Wars, it's like, yeah, I can, I actually can say that my first movie I ever saw was A New Hope, because my dad, who was a big science fiction fan, took me to see it when I was 6 months old, which is like a bad idea. But, he really wanted to see it. And I think this is like August 1978, which is not 77, but like films in those days, they went out, they came back, they did extended runs, they kind of did repeat runs. So, yeah, that's the kind of the screening that I've pinned it down to. And then he used to go away for like trips. He was worked in advertising, so he'd go for trips to Taiwan and Japan and bring back like toys, Star Wars toys that you could not get in New Zealand, which is where I'm from. And it's like, I just remember like unpacking suitcases, and it's like the X-Wing, the Kenner X-Wing, and the AT-AT, and the Snowspeeder, and like all these, the action figures. So I was really lucky. I mean, that's like super privileged Star Wars childhood. But yeah, and then that was in my blood, really. And here I am. Yeah, this is a kind of weird thing. And here I am. We're talking about Star Wars. To continue the kind of things, like you said yourself, that these are the things that you still watch and read. It's like, yeah, because it's so cool. What we get to do is amazing.
Oh, it's quite a blessing. So I want to talk about what writing this book means to you, both as a fan and also as a professional writer, because I feel like they're the same, but they're very different.
Yeah, because I really wanted to write a book that, as a fan, I was like, what am I gonna read? What would I want to read? What is going to be really the story that I'd want to hear? So, Shadow of the Sith is Luke and Lando on that adventure that Lando talks about in The Rise of Skywalker, where he says to Rey, "Oh, me and Luke were chasing Ochi of Bestoon to look for the Wayfinder. We didn't find it." That's Shadow of the Sith. So it's like about 20 years after Return of the Jedi, and it's in that big empty period between Return of the Jedi and the sequel trilogy. So I thought, as a fan, I'm like, well, what can I do? So I treated it really as like episode 6.5. If Return of the Jedi is episode 6 and The Force Awakens is episode 7, this is like the epic adventure in the middle. So as a fan, I was like super excited and geeked out, because it's not often that a Star Wars book can make or do such a big story, because for various reasons they're often tied into different properties. But yeah, I was kind of given free rein, which is great as a fan. So then, as a professional writer, it's like, okay, I got to get to work. What am I going to do? So it was a long process of outlining and getting things together, but also aware that I'm producing I love writing tie-in books. I've done before Star Wars, I've done others, and I really love the fact that you're using characters that people love, and understand and know and are familiar with, millions of people, and thing with tie-in fiction for me is like you have to get that absolutely right, because if something goes wrong, like people are going to know immediately if you get it wrong. And I was aware, like I had Luke Skywalker, Lando Calrissian, and other characters. It was like I had to kind of really nail them as characters. So it was kind of my professional hat on. I was like, okay, this is the job. Get down to it. Meanwhile, the fan side of me is going, I can't believe I get to do this story. This is like, what's going on? Is this real life?
Do you remember where you were when you first got the note that you were going to get to write this book?
Oh yeah. I mean that's a whole story, but like I can't really talk about it except to say I was doing a book for The Mandalorian, an original novel, which we had to cancel, and obviously I was disappointed because I love The Mandalorian. But then it's like, oh well, we've got this other book. You know, if you want to do it, it's Luke and Lando. And I was just like, are you kidding me? Yeah, of course I do it. So yeah, I can remember that very well because it was that kind of thing of like, seriously, it's like that. That's the other book, which is great because also I remember when I first saw Rise of Skywalker, like that scene where Lando talks to Rey and he's like, "Oh yeah, me and Luke." I immediately thought, like, what are they doing? Like Luke and Lando are such an odd pairing, really. What are they doing for this adventure? And it really, even it's just like well, years before I got to do the book, it's like that really struck me as like a really interesting point and a really interesting story to be told. It's like, again, this is the fan side of me. It's like, and I get to tell it, which is crazy. Even as I say it now, it's like, really? Okay, cool.
It's just great to hear it out loud. So you have a strong reputation in the industry as a writer, and you've worked on several other IPs. What makes Star Wars different as a project, and what is your mindset like for a project of this magnitude?
Yeah, I mean, Star Wars is Star Wars. Like, there's no, I mean, that sounds stupidly obvious, but like, there's no getting away from the fact that like it's the biggest of the biggest. I've always wanted to do a Star Wars story. I did the short stories in the from a certain point of view anthologies, and I also wrote a backup in one of the IDW Star Wars Adventures all ages comics, and yeah, like what an honor and a privilege to be able to write Star Wars, and again, it just goes back to the kind of the fan in me thinking this is amazing, and then the professional in me going, okay, we've got a job to do. But I'm very aware that like I'm lucky to be doing what I love, and I'm lucky that I was given a book like this because Star Wars is a great thing because it has such a breadth of storytelling available. There's the Skywalker saga and the kind of Star Wars mythos, but if you break it down, you've got the books and comics, you've got animated, you've got the Disney Plus shows, you've got the main movies, you've got kind of other movies. So to be able to like tell a meaningful story that fits into part of that saga and kind of links all together, yeah, really, really cool.
So it's like
I keep saying it's really cool. I keep saying it's really cool, but like honestly,
no.
I love Star Wars, and this book it's exciting. I've written it. It's exciting.
You were preaching to the choir, my friend. I think it is insanely cool. Well, I mean, even so much as like I know you've done a lot of stuff with Stranger Things. Obviously, they're very different characters, different mythologies, but still, at its core, it's things that we enjoy, that we're passionate about. Stranger Things doesn't have a long history of Star Wars, but there's still things that we're beholden to as a fan and as a professional. And I love the way that you blend that line so beautifully.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, and like this is the thing, like Stranger Things, again, I'm a fan of Stranger Things, and it's just this thing that a lot of people are looking at the book and they know Stranger Things better than I do. People know Star Wars better than I do. So it's really making sure I get it right and I like live up to the expectations that people have, because as fans, all of us have sky high expectations, and whatever the story we have in our head is never what we actually get is never as good as the story in our head. But like hopefully I can I think I did it with Stranger Things. I wrote like 2 books for Elementary, which is that modern day Sherlock Holmes series, Johnny Lee Miller and Lucy Liu, and again it was like, okay, I'm a fan of Elementary, so let's do two like extended mid-season episodes. And I'm always aware of, as a fan, of like, what do people want? What are they expecting? If you see a Star Wars book on the shelf, like, what do you want out of it? Which is kind of like my core thing with any sort of tie-in project.
I think that's so cool. I love the metacognitive approach to it. So you mentioned this is 20 years after Return of the Jedi. You said episode 6.5, just playfully. But is there anything else we need to know before we start reading the novel, as far as where we are in the beginning?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think so. It's a book that you can kind of go into. So it's definitely it's linking the original trilogy and the sequel trilogy, perhaps more than we have been able to explore until now. So Luke and Lando, I mean, this is not quite 20 years after Return of the Jedi, so they're in very different places to where we know them. Well, I mean, especially with like Luke Skywalker, we've seen him at the end of Mandalorian and Book of Boba Fett. That kind of post Return of the Jedi Luke, sort of in Mandalorian, we have kind of the Jedi warrior, and then in Book of Boba Fett, we kind of had the Jedi master, teaching Grogu. And then Lando is someone that like we haven't seen. He's in Return of the Jedi. He's in Rise of Skywalker. It's like, what was he doing in the middle? So again, he's in a very different place. But again, like for someone going into the story, it's a book for everybody. And this goes back. I'm repeating myself, but it goes back to the whole thing of like, what do people want out of what do I want out of a Star Wars book? What do people want out of a Star Wars book? And it's like it's got Luke Skywalker and Lando Calrissian on the cover, and lightsabers. Like that's the baseline. Anything else from there, like Star Wars Celebration, we were talking now afterwards, but I kind of joked about recommended reading for this book, and I said, there's like Dark Legends by George Mann. There's things like, there's the Aftermath trilogy by Chuck Wendig, obviously. Revenge of the Sith by Matthew Stover. Any Star Wars book by Mike Stackpole, because he's amazing. Yes. But like these are things, if people kind of get extra things out of Shadow of the Sith, then that's awesome. But like it's also a book that you can just like go with it, I think.
Absolutely. So Shadow of the Sith, again, comes out June 28th, fills in some integral story beats that we first learned about in The Rise of Skywalker that you mentioned previously. Since we don't really have much context for Luke at this stage in his life, what key elements are essential for you about that character to include? And what was your research like for getting in the mindset of this legendary Jedi?
Yeah, Luke Skywalker is like, you could say, the main character of Star Wars. So I was aware that I was kind of been given the privilege of working with such an important character. So, as I mentioned, he's sort of at a very different place to how we know him. And I think, or how we knew him in like Return of the Jedi. And I think at this point of time, he's probably the most powerful person in the galaxy. But he's aware of that fact, and he's aware of his power. And I think one of the things about Shadow of the Sith is that every decision that he makes, he's weighing up what he should do and what he could do, because he has first-hand experience of what the power of the Force can do to someone if they let it. Like he's he's got the prime experience of that. So I kind of like to borrow from another IP. With great power comes great responsibility. So he's aware of that. So he's very measured. When we see him in the Book of Boba Fett, where he's training Grogu, as I mentioned, that's like the Jedi Master kind of mode, where he's very like calm and reasoned and operating on like a very even level. But then on the other hand, he can go into the warrior mode if he needs to, which we saw in Mandalorian. He's a really interesting character because he's got these multiple sides. At the same time, in the back of his mind is like, I know what happened to my father. I know what the dark side of the Force can do. And I have this great power within me. So, yeah, he's He's interesting to write. He's very complicated. Like, he's the farm boy from Tatooine in A New Hope. In Empire Strikes Back, he's the competent rebellion officer, and pilot, training to be a Jedi. In Return of the Jedi, he's a Jedi, and you can see in those three films even the change in his character. So when you mentioned research, it's like, well, we don't see him after Return of the Jedi, except in recently The Mandalorian and Book of Boba Fett. There's a few comics and there's a few books, but not much. So that was kind of good in a way, because I was free to develop his character and what I thought his path would be. If you take him 20 years beyond Return of the Jedi, and we've seen he's building his temple, he's researching the Jedi and the Sith, trying to rebuild the Order. Like, what would that be when he's kind of 18, 19, 20 years down the track?
And what you just said really made me realize how hard it must be to write him, because it's probably like writing Superman. Someone that's so powerful. Yeah, you have to do something that's worthy of the character, but it also is a challenge for the character too. And I think you completely nail it in this book too.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, he's Superman's an interesting comparison, because like people say that Superman is boring character because what can you do? He's invincible, invulnerable, all these powers. But that is actually what makes it interesting, because Superman and Luke Skywalker, they're aware of their powers, and when you have that self-awareness and also the kind of moral compass, that really helps guide stories.
This is Vanessa Marshall, and you're listening to Coffee with Kenobi.
We'll flip a little bit and talk about the other featured character in this book, Lando Calrissian. How has fatherhood changed Lando Calrissian, and what did you learn about Lando while writing this book?
Yeah, Lando was very interesting because I was able to really impact his character in quite a meaningful way, which is rare for like a main character in Star Wars, because you have to kind of you can bring them in, do something, and then you got to put them back where they were. Lando, as we know, his daughter was kidnapped about 6 years before the events of the book, which we hear a little bit about in Rise of Skywalker, because he's searching for his daughter. He didn't find her. And it's interesting because we know Lando as the gambler, the playboy, raconteur, ladies' man, etc. And then to lose his daughter, like what? I mean, that's obviously a massive personal tragedy, but like, what would that do to someone like Lando, who is so outgoing and extroverted and confident? Like, what would that do to him? So he's in a very different place when we meet him. Not only that, he's been searching for his daughter for 6 years and he hasn't found her. So like, it's not just that initial loss of his daughter, but then it's like, well, this quest is going on and he's been unsuccessful. So again, what does that do to a character having had this trauma, and then it kind of doesn't get resolved? So he was really, I really like Lando, and he was very different to write because of these things that have changed. So it was the blending of that Billy D. Williams exuberance with an older, wiser. He's older than Luke anyway, sort of in the Star Wars universe. And of course, it's to Luke that he goes when he learns about Ochi and the Wayfinder. So he has his own personal unfulfilled. I mean, I call it a quest, but like it's a personal thing that he needs to get done, and he's aware that time is ticking, and if he doesn't get a lead soon, then it's going to get harder and harder. So yeah, he's nice. He's a really cool character, and he was kind of older and mellower. But also he's Lando Calrissian. Like he can deal with things. He can take care of business, and he's doing that the best that he can.
For sure, and you're able to make him more than one dimensional and give him some sides. It creates a unique level of pathos I think, with the audience. But you mentioned this earlier in our conversation. What a unique pairing, Lando Calrissian and Luke Skywalker. So the team of these two, what do you feel like as foils? What do they bring out in each other?
Yeah, so goes back to that thing I was saying. Like when I saw the Rise of Skywalker, I was like, Luke and Lando. That's a weird combo because in the original trilogy, they have like a hug at the end of Return of the Jedi. I mean, Lando rescues him from the underneath of Cloud City, but like they don't really interact very much. There is more in the comics than that. But yeah, they are very different characters, so they are very much an odd couple kind of pairing. Especially also because even if their paths kind of drew together in Return of the Jedi, they have then separated out because Luke has gone off into do his temple and research the Jedi and reform the Order, and Lando goes off to do whatever Lando does. Ultimately, I mean that's a whole book on its own, but like ultimately to meet the love of his life and he has a daughter, and and then that changes. So they've kind of come together and then they've gone apart and then they've come together again. So yeah, like there's a politeness between them initially, I think, because they are old friends, but they didn't really know each other that well. And then there's frustrations because like Luke is the Jedi Master, and his view of the universe is so different to Lando's. Lando's practical, and he's out to have fun. Had his life turned out the way he wanted it, whereas Luke is measured and looking for deeper meaning in things because of his nature. So the two of them meeting, there's a bit of friction, but there's also a kind of camaraderie, which is really good. And they learn about each other during the book, I think, and they learn to appreciate the other's point of view.
I'm certainly looking forward to the discourse once people have read this book, because I've always said, if you really want to learn something, you write about it or you teach it. And
right.
I feel like your experiences through this have certainly been very unique. So that with a unique pairing like this, and it makes me want to read the book again, just talking to you and hearing your thought process. But let's look at Ochi of Bestoon. What makes this villain tick, and what does he bring to the Star Wars universe? He's basically a footnote in the Rise of Skywalker.
Yeah, again, he's one of these things. You see him for 5 seconds and then he's gone. He's obviously he plays. Well, he was introduced after the movie, but in an earlier time period in the Darth Vader comic by Greg Pak, where he plays quite a large role. So that was an important sort of research note for me in writing it. Ochi I mean, let's be honest, he's kind of weird. When we see him in The Rise of Skywalker, we only really see his face, his kind of scarred face. He's got like a cybernetic implant. In the making of documentary, we actually see more. So we see him kind of waist up with his black costume and like super evil and nasty looking. And then in the Vader comic, which is set between Empire Strikes Back and I think Return of the Jedi, like he's a jerk. I mean, honestly, he's in the comic, he's sent by the Emperor to kind of test Vader, but like test Vader's patience, I think, rather than anything else, because he's like this wisecracking, not bumbling, but like you can imagine this kind of chalk and cheese with him paired with Vader. When we see him in Shadow of the Sith, this is 20 years later, where he's obsessed with Exegol. In the comic, he actually visits Exegol with Vader. So as his kind of life falls apart, he becomes obsessed with getting back to Exegol because he thinks that's the secret place where everything will be made right, which then makes him the ultimate sort of tool for the Emperor to use to hunt Rey, which is the whole story that Lando tells to Rey in The Rise of Skywalker. So again, he was different to the comic because this is later. Things have changed. He's really fallen on hard times. And as a villain, he's kind of interesting because he's got an obsession, and like a villain with an obsession is dangerous because what have they got to lose? It's like all or nothing. So it's, yeah, for Luke and Lando to kind of encounter this character, and also knowing what Ochi is going to do, because this is the thing about the Rise of Skywalker, is like we know what Ochi does. He kills Rey's parents. We see that again in another kind of 5-second flashback. So yeah, he was very interesting. So it's like he was heading towards a really terrible kind of end, which I was aware of. But he's definitely a kind of a man obsessed, which is, yeah, like the worst kind of villain.
Well, I think those are some excellent teasers. Everyone definitely needs to go out and purchase this book. It's really going to be, it fills in a fundamental gap in the Star Wars timeline. But I want to talk to you on a personal level and tell me what Star Wars Celebration was like for you.
It was incredible. It's my first celebration. Like I've been to, I go to things like San Diego Comic-Con, which is obviously massive, but that's all different things. So to go to a huge event where it was all Star Wars, and like everybody wanted to be there, and they're kind of your people. Like you don't need any explanations or anything. I went to a panel which was monsters from Return of the Jedi, and like they showed some close-ups of Jabba's kind of build, and the guy's like, well, Jabba had a tattoo on his arm, right? And everyone was like, yeah, of course. This is a Star Wars Celebration. Of course, there's rumors of 1,000 people knew that he had a tattoo. But there was a kind of the feeling, and just a real joy to be able to, celebrate Star Wars with fans. And for me, it's kind of good timing because my book was coming out, and people were just really excited about Shadow of the Sith. It's one of those things. You're a writer. You work at home on your own. You do work. Yeah, you work with a publisher and publicist and all that, but you don't really know, or you don't really understand the impact you might have until you kind of go out there and meet readers. So that was really cool. And I was kind of excited because it was a huge event. This is my first one. But I'm hooked. I'm going. That's it. I'm going every year now.
Hello, and then next year it'll be in London. So
yeah,
it's brilliant, absolutely brilliant. Well, Adam, what other projects do you have coming soon that you're allowed to talk about?
Well, you see, to quote Admiral Akbar, it's a trap, right? I can't answer that question. Like this is mean. How can I answer that? I've got, as well as writing things like Star Wars, I do write my own original books. So I've got, they call it original, not licensed. I've got a couple on the way, which I can't mention yet. And then, my lips are sealed. That's like the most boring answer. But yeah, it's so.
I think it's a wonderful answer because it means we have more Adam Christoper to look forward to, and the anticipation sometimes is just as good as the experience itself. Well, Adam, it's been a wonderful experience chatting with you. You're certainly welcome to come on for a cup of coffee, tea, or any beverage of your choosing anytime. Please let people know they can reach out to you if they want to ask any questions or just say hello online.
So I'm on Twitter as Ghostfinder. I'm on there most of the time. You can just drop me a message. My website is adamchristopher.me, where you can find all my other books and stuff. There I am.
Wonderful. Well, again, Star Wars Shadows of the Sith by Adam Christoper goes on sale June 28th. Adam, thank you again for being a guest on Coffee with Kenobi.
Right. Thank you very much for having me. Real pleasure.
This podcast is not endorsed by the Walt Disney Company or Lucasfilm Limited. It is intended for entertainment and informational purposes only. The official Star Wars website can be found at www.starwars.com. Star Wars, all names, sounds, and any other Star Wars-related items are registered trademarks and/or copyrights of Disney and their respective trademark and copyright holders. All original content of this podcast is the intellectual property of Coffee with Kenobi unless otherwise indicated.
This is the podcast you're looking for.